Okay, Bruchim Habaim. Welcome, Holy Blossom, and many guests from near and far. Sohoraim Tovim, good afternoon to fellow Trantonians, and Erev Tov to Professor Gabi Ben-Dor, who is joining us from his kitchen in Haifa. Now, everyone is welcome to greet one another through the chat box. Tell us where you're from. It'd be great to know how far and wide we are. Oops. I'm not sure we need that Zoom link. Is that, there we go. Okay, we're just settling in with from the tech side. So one of the things I so admire about the Holy Blossom community in particular and the Toronto Jewish community in general is the deep and natural love for Israel. We are politically right, left, and center, yes. And politically, of course, our Zionism can get complicated, but our attachment to Israel is not complicated. Our tie to Israel is clear and strong and direct. About 100 years ago, Chaim Nachman Bialik said that reading the Hebrew Bible in translation is like kissing your mother through a veil. It seems that for well over a year now, our love for Israel has been out of necessity, only expressed through a veil. We read and we watch, but it's not the same as being there. We have enjoyed incredible virtual tours of Israel. We've even received boxes of Israeli goods so that we can enjoy the tastes and the smells of Israel. We have live streamed in the voices of sister congregations in Israel, serenading Shabbat with their melodies. But it's often a bittersweet reunion online. Through the veil of the screen, we mourn for the 45 boys and men who were swept away on Mount Meron on Lag BaOmer. Through the veil of the screen, we celebrate Israel's accomplishments in being to the world a leading example of responsible healthcare. Let's hear it for Israel. And we delight in seeing how life in Israel is opening up again. It gives us hope for what's on the horizon for us. When we fantasize about where we will travel when it's safe to travel again, many answer Israel, of course, because Israel is calling. We need to tag home base again after all that we have endured. We need the spiritual uplift that Israel provides. We need to attach ourselves to the place where our ancestors walked to feel the anchor of life as we know it. We need to witness the vitality of Jewish life in the streets and in the open city squares. And from these gray days of lockdown in Toronto, we dream of the warm sun and the spark of bright energy which so many Israelis have. So thank you, Posen family, for bringing Israel closer to us today through your ongoing generosity. And thank you, Professor Ben-Dor, for keeping us connected to the people and places we love, for drawing us nearer today to Am Yisrael, the people of Israel, to Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, and to Medinat Yisrael, the state of Israel. Before I invite David Posen to share some words which will honor the memories of Harry and Blanche Posen, Zichronam Livracha, just a few instructions for us. We are delighted to have more than 220 devices open with us now. In order to avoid any disruptions, please do keep yourselves muted throughout the program. You are, however, welcome and encouraged to write your questions in the chat box at any time throughout the lecture. And our moderators, Rabbi Goodman and Les Rothschild from our Israel Engagement Committee, will be scanning your questions and drawing from them so that at the end of the lecture, there can be a real exchange between professor and the questions that the students have brought. And if you prefer that your question remain anonymous, you can send it privately to Rabbi Goodman, all through the chat box. So it's wonderful to see all these places from near and far. Really welcome everyone. And David, I turn it over to you now.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you on behalf of the Posen Spiegel Cohen family. We're a big bunch, to our annual memorial lecture, which we established over 30 years ago to honor our parents, Harry and Blanche Posen. We started with two themes that were really close to their hearts, Judaism and lifelong learning. But over the years, our focus shifted, as Rabbi Splansky mentioned, toward Israel. And our most popular speaker by far over the years has been Professor Gabi Ben-Dor from the University of Haifa in Israel. And Gabi has also honored us with by becoming a very close and valued family friend. Gabi is professor, and I'm going to have to read this so I don't stumble over words. Gabi is professor of political science and director of the National Security Studies program at the University of Haifa. He was a director of studies at the National Defense College, has taught most of Israel's military leaders, and was senior advisor on strategic affairs to the Israeli Ministry of Defense. So he's been quite connected over all of these years. He's written 7 books, over 120 scholarly journal articles, and has lectured all over the world. So the respite from all that travel, Gabi, I'm sure was quite welcome. Every year, Gabi seems to arrive at a time of confusion or even crisis in Israel and the Middle East. And this year, of course, is no exception. And every year, he helps us make sense of what's going on. He not only knows the issues, but he's well connected and knows many of the personalities as well. The title of his lecture this year is Continuity, Change, and Contradictions, Israeli Politics and Society Today. And talk about confusion. There's a lot to talk about, and there's a lot going on in Israel, notwithstanding even the tragedy of last week. Gabi, we are absolutely delighted to welcome you again, even if only virtually. Thank you again for honoring us with your lecture each year, and in so doing, helping us to honor our late parents. So with no further ado, I would say the floor is all yours, but today the screen is all yours. Welcome, Professor Gabi Ben-Dor.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you, Rabbi Splansky. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, the entire family. It's been a very important part of my life to come every year to Toronto and to deliver this lecture. As David mentioned, his parents had been attached to the double notion of Judaism and lifelong learning. And in fact, in my lecture tonight, I would like to emphasize these two themes, not having been here for 2 years. I also want to warn you that the lecture tonight will be, tonight for me, this early afternoon for you in Toronto, might be very different. I will try to clear up some of the confusion, even though I'm a great fan of Shakespeare, who wrote in King Lear the famous sentence, "Confusion is king." In Israel, confusion is the republic. But I really would not like you to think that what I'm doing is repeating the newspaper headlines. Lapid said this to Bennett, and Bennett said this to Bibi, and Bibi said this to somebody else. You can read that in the newspaper, you can read it on the websites, which you must be following. And I don't want to get into that kind of discussion. My whole point will be that I would like you to go home after this lecture, telling yourselves that we have learned something in Israel which we had not known before, or which we had not realized before, or which we had not internalized and digested before. So I think I'm going to inflict upon you a lecture which will be more ambitious. It will purport to reach greater depth than usual discussion. And you might not get answers to some of the questions that bother you. For example, I cannot tell you who will be the prime minister in 1 week's time, partly because nobody knows. I can give you some pointers as to what is going on in the political system. But Israel is more than a political system. You know about the Israeli government and Israeli politicians and such. But Israel is a vibrant, dynamic, rapidly changing society. And if you haven't been here for 2 years, which is probably the case for most of you, you might not even recognize the country. It has changed so much. So I'm going to try and live up to all these expectations, if that's what you have. And once again, I would like to thank the Posen Spiegel Cohen clan. It's more than a family, it's really a clan, for inviting me, and more than that, for making me a friend of the family, at times feeling like a member of the family. I feel greatly attached to the family. I have a almost daily correspondence with Steve and David, so we've been in touch throughout the pandemic month. And it's a real pleasure for me to be here even in this way. And I pray that in Yirtzeh Hashem next year, we will meet once again in person. So in the meantime, let me try and entertain you a little bit with some thoughts about Judaism and what I try to accomplish in this lecture today. What I would like to say is that what I do when I communicate with you, when I prepare a lecture for you, when I listen to your questions and comments, I pursue wisdom. I would like to be wiser than I was before, often successfully. And I do this even when we are not in touch in person. I do this when I read the 5 books by David, which are on my shelf, actually 6 books, one of them in 2 editions. Am I right, David? All together. I'm greatly intrigued always when I reread the 2 marvelous books by Dov Marmor, an old friend of mine who used to be a senior rabbi of this temple, is now a senior citizen in Jerusalem, with whom I'm in constant touch. I'm always intrigued rereading the books that my good friend David DeWitt and I have produced together, and so on and so forth. And I even learn a great deal of wisdom for the humorous emails sent to me by Steve 5-6 times a day on the average. They are also a source of wisdom. So what kind of wisdom are we trying to pursue? Who is a wise person according to the Jewish tradition? I could quote many sources. Here's my favorite. If you cannot read the Hebrew part, don't worry about it. Here is the English translation. This is from Pirkei Avot, which is what we read by Jewish tradition Saturday afternoons between Pesach and Shavuot. And so Ben Zoma said, who is one that is wise? Who is the wise person? One who learns from every person, as it is said, from all my teachers have I gained understanding. Now, that's a very tricky verse from the Hebrew Bible, because it can have many more interpretations than one. So one interpretation is, from all my teachers I have gained understanding. That's fine. But another interpretation, which I have read, said more ambitiously, I've learned more than all my teachers. The Hebrew can be translated that way too. But since I'm married to a Hebrew teacher who is an expert on the Hebrew language, I've learned that there is yet another way of interpreting this sentence, which is, I have learned from all those who would teach me. Which means I consider everybody I come in contact with as a source of wisdom. Every human encounter is a potential source of wisdom. And so I've learned from all those who would teach me. And you are my teachers, just as I am your teacher. And I think the two go together. So for me, this is a learning experience. I already know more than I did because I prepared this lecture. And I'm sure that a lecture will be delivered somewhat differently than planned. And I will learn a great deal from the chat box and from your endless emails following, according to my experience. But who is a wise person in this interpretation? Mine. So I call the 7 components of wisdom the 7 pearls of wisdom, because each of the 7 starts with the letter P. I like alliteration. So I think a wise person has 7 attributes, which an unwise person, not a stupid person, but maybe even a smart person, but not a wise person, doesn't possess. A wise person has a sense of perspective. He or she knows where he or she stands in relationship to the subject, has a sense of proportion. Not everything is important, not everything is major, not every failure is a major tragedy, has a sense of profundity. Depth goes beyond the headlines, goes beyond the surface, goes beyond what is immediately apparent to the naked eye, is able to detect patterns. The world is not entirely chaotic. Things get repeated, things go in cycles. There's a certain regularity in human phenomena. There is something called problématique in French, which is poorly translated into English as problemation, meaning that we not only study a subject, but we try to express what we know, what we have learned, knowledge we have acquired by way of problems. What is it that I can answer by way of a question? What kind of solution can I offer to the problem? A wise person looks at the potential of what he or she studies, not only what he or she sees at the moment, but uses imagination, uses intuition, uses foresight, uses the ability to ask questions. Could it have been otherwise? Can it be different in the future? And finally, a wise person is prudent, doesn't go quickly into judgment, doesn't dismiss others, and tries to be careful about generalizing about the world and others. Now, let me surprise you. I want to start talking about Israel, not about Netanyahu, not about the government, and not about any of the other things, although I could. For example, the Meron tragedy, to which the rabbi alluded, touched me very deeply. My son, whom Joy Cohen here knows very well, was there with two of his children. Luckily, they got home after very difficult adventures, safe and sound. But I don't want to talk about it. I want to talk about economics, for example, which is a source of great controversy in Israel. And I want to share with you some good news. For the first time in its history, a month ago, Israel entered the top 20 in GDP per capita, which is the best measure of economic well-being in the world. And that means a great deal, because the data were compiled by Forbes, a very reliable magazine, based on IMF data, very reliable data, which shows that Israel, with a GDP per capita of $43,689, ranks now above Canada, New Zealand, and many, many other major Western countries. And of course, if you want to see what is happening, you have to know the following. The GDP per capita in Israel, as I said, ranks 19th out of 20, just surpassing Canada for the first time by a small margin. Then comes New Zealand, and the mighty UK. Great Britain is way behind, $3,000 behind Israel, which is unbelievable. Now, Israel seems to be emerging from its battle against the coronavirus pandemic like every other country, with a battered economy and massive unemployment, but still in better shape than other developed nations. The GDP shrank by 2.5% last year, which is the worst contraction in record in Israel. But this has to be compared to an average drop of 6.6% for the European Union, a 3.5% decline in the US, and a 5.5% contraction on average in OECD countries, which are the developed countries in the world. The fact that Israel has fared better economically in coping with the crisis than other developed nations, thanks to its booming tech sector, helped the country climb up its GDP per capita ranking, says Forbes. Now, if you are interested in the entire table of the league, Luxembourg tops the world, unbelievably, GDP capita of 116,000, followed by Switzerland, no surprise there, Ireland, which is surprising, Norway 4th, US 5th, and the data showed another astounding statistic, which I couldn't believe, so I looked it up, and it's true, that the financial assets per household in Israel go as high as $112,000 per house, not per person, per household, per family, versus higher than Norway, higher than France, higher than Germany, higher than Finland, and higher than Portugal, of course. So that's economics, and that's good news. Even better news is the World Happiness Report for 2021, just released a while ago. Because economics measures your financial and material well-being, but the happiness report tries to measure your subjective feeling of well-being, and here are the results. Israel has now climbed to the 12th rank in the world, according to the latest United Nations World Happiness Report, up 2 spots from the 2020 survey released last year, just as the coronavirus pandemic was gaining speed across the world. So what we now have is a report produced by the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which ranks countries by how happy their citizens perceive themselves to be, according to 6 key variables: GDP per capita, social support, healthy life expectancy, freedom to make life choices, generosity, and freedom from corruption. Now, it was Finland's 4th consecutive year in first place in the annual report, which is really amazing. A small country, way up north, cold and dark, with a fairly high rate of suicide, drinking, and stuff. Nevertheless, it ranks first in the world for 4 consecutive years. The mighty US has slipped from 18th place last year to 19th. And as I said, Finland, which has been first for 4 years in a row, still clearly the leader. But other than the leader, the only countries ahead of Israel are on the list are the Scandinavian countries, namely Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and Iceland. Also Switzerland, Luxembourg, very wealthy, Austria, very wealthy, Central European, German-speaking countries, New Zealand and Australia, and that is all. Most European countries trail Israel. Germany is just behind Israel, 13th, the UK, 17th, France, 21st, Spain, 27th, Italy, 28th. And if you want to go to the North American continent, the US is 19th, and Canada, 14th. So Canada too is behind Israel. I must say that I don't encourage competition between Israel and Canada, the 2 countries I like most. But since I have lived, these are the 2 countries where I have lived most of my life, also in the US, I always look at the data comparing the country I live in with Canada. And this is the first time that I have seen Israel ahead of Canada in both the economic measurements and in subjective measurements of subjective happiness. I must admit that also I'm encouraged by the fact that Israel ranks particularly high in the specific categories measuring optimism about the future. If you want to look at the table of the happy countries, here's the table of happiness. I will, of course, send this presentation to the organizers. And if you want to take a look at the data, you're welcome. So what are the good things in Israeli life? Again, bear in mind that I'm not in a hurry to get to politics. Good things in Israeli life, as far as I'm concerned, are the following. First of all, that life expectancy in Israel is among the highest in the world, almost 2 years above the average in the developed countries of the world. The healthcare system has turned out to be among the best in the world, which is a surprise. We Israelis like to swear and curse at our health providers. We hate to stand in line, and we don't always get the prescriptions we want, and we have to wait for a special kind of treatment, and you don't always get hospitalized where you want to be. But I must tell you that in this terrible test of the best, in the pandemic, our healthcare system just performed brilliantly. It turns out that there was enough competition between the 4, but they were not too fragmented, and all of them are highly digitized. Everything is computerized, everything is available on an open website to the members of the health fund. And we could see when we wanted to get our shots, it worked brilliantly. And apparently, even though financially it is not as well off as some of the other systems comparable in the world, like the British one, for example, or the Canadian one for that matter, our system has worked very nicely because of the structure of 4 competing, that's one. And second, the computerized systems that we are using. And I hope that many of the things that we learned with the healthcare system working during the pandemic, namely that you can get many things done from afar via the computer. You don't have to stand in line, you don't have to go there. You can make better use of pharmacies, you can make better use of nurses, you can communicate with your doctors from afar. So that, I think that's wonderful. The third thing I would like to mention is that Israelis are more satisfied with their work. That's another surprise for me from the data. We all like, once again, to complain. We work too hard, we don't get paid well enough, we hate our bosses, we don't get promoted, blah, blah, blah. But it turns out that Israel is very, very high with work satisfaction, far ahead of most OECD countries. Also, social support. Israelis believe that they will be supported in case of need by friends, neighbors, and others, like non-governmental organizations, when in need, far more than in other countries. So even though we have all the social privileges and we sometimes hate each other, actually we count on each other and we support each other, voluntary organizations and such. Again, you could see this during the pandemic. And you can ask some people who were here in Israel. There are some people now back in Canada who were in Israel during the pandemic. Fantastic things happened. I mean, some of my friends told me just they woke up in the morning and they found a meal delivered, ready on their doorstep, just because people figured out among their neighbors that they are old people, they are vulnerable to the pandemic and they should not leave their home. So what are they going to eat? So without even asking permission and of course, without expecting thanks, people just fed each other. Or, I mean, I got notes from my neighbors during the pandemics. If you are unable to go out to get your prescriptions, I will go for you to the pharmacy because I'm younger. I'm in less of the danger, less at risk. So that was very, very pronounced during the pandemic. And once again, Israelis are among the most optimistic countries in the world. That is very, very important. When you ask Israelis how things are today, sometimes they are satisfied, sometimes they are not. But when you ask them what they think will happen in the future, will their children live better lives than the parents? The answer is by far the most impressive one, very high in a very high percentage. Let's take a look at life expectancy. Just for data, I'm a great believer in data where you can get them. So you can see that actually only 8 countries are better shape than Israel. And only one of them is a surprise, which is Italy. I don't quite get the reasons for that. But as you can see, most developed countries are way behind Israel on that score. Now, let's be honest. There are many bad things in Israeli life. And let's take a look at them and see what the reason for them is. First, low rate of productivity. Low rate of productivity means that it takes more hours to produce the same good that people produce in other countries. In general, we have more hours to work. We have longer work weeks than other countries, shorter weekends, fewer holidays. And lower productivity also has to do with a point I will make later in greater detail, which is poor infrastructure in the country. We have high cost of living. Mind you, I would like to explain this. High cost of living doesn't mean inflation, because the cost of living index doesn't go up in Israel. It's very stable. There is no inflation. It is just that we started out higher than other countries. You buy a hamburger in Tel Aviv, it will cost you more than in Toronto. You buy a car in Israel, it will cost you a lot more than it will cost you in London. And so on and so forth. Particularly is this so when it comes to housing, where the cost of a housing unit is very high. And culture in Israel sanctifies owning a house, a home. Israelis take it for granted that one of the most important things that is expected of them when they get married is to acquire a permanent home, which is owned by them with a mortgage and everything else. Very few places are for rent. And so that restricts mobility because you buy your home and get stuck there. It also restricts your ability to use your money efficiently because a very high percentage goes to paying off the mortgage. And the high cost of living and high cost of housing are particularly hurting younger people who just get married and try to raise a family. And they have to work for many, many years to get the house or the home they would like. And the high cost of living means that they constantly compare what they can buy here to what they can buy abroad. They go to Berlin and they buy the same milk chocolate favorite of theirs for half the price. Again, the price is not rising, but it's not going down either. So somehow the figures are a bit misleading because the GDP per capita goes up, but the cost of living doesn't really go down. A very important point I would like you to grasp deeply is the following. The growth of population in Israel is the highest without comparison among Western democracies. Actually, Israel is one of the few Western democracies which grows, along with the US and just a couple of others. All the others, for example, all the European countries are shrinking by way of population because people don't have children, because people are very selfish, because people would like to realize their own dreams and ambitions. And having children, as we all know, is a great joy, of course. But it's a huge responsibility. It's a lifelong commitment. It is inconvenient. It takes up and eats up all your resources. And in general, it means the kind of life where you don't control your own fate. You are not master of your own time, of your own priorities. It's an entirely different lifestyle when you have a family. The Western Europeans don't want to have families like that. So many of them have one child just to make sure that they have a family. And they would like to have more dogs and more cars and more places where they can have a nice weekend retreat than children. And so Israel is one of the few exceptions to this, where we have large families and the population grows at a decent rate of something like 2% net every year. That's a lot. That means that in less than 5 years, you have a 10% larger population. Israel's population today, by the way, is 9.3 million citizens. I don't include any Palestinian territories, blah, blah. 9.3 million citizens of Israel. Roughly speaking, 75% Jewish, 20% Arab, and 5% other. The 5% other are mostly new immigrants from the former Soviet Union who are not halachically Jewish, and several tens of thousands of Christians who are not Arabs. So actually in Israel now we have over 7 million Jews, which is a lifelong dream, because Ben Gurion used to say always, we don't really have a Jewish state unless and until we have 6 million Jews here. 6 million replacing, of course, the 6 million murdered during the Holocaust. Now we have 7 million. And we have a different kind of problem. The population, thank God, is growing rapidly, but you need an infrastructure which keeps pace. If in 4.5 years, we'll have 10% more people, will we have 10% more beds in the hospitals? Will we have 10% more classrooms in the schools? Will we have 10% more roads across the country? So far, no, we haven't kept pace. And so there has been declining investment in infrastructure, for example, in higher education, for example, in building new hospitals, worst of all, roads. So now we have a poor public transportation system which completely collapsed during the pandemic. In the pandemic, the health system worked brilliantly, the educational system so-so, the public transportation system not at all. It simply collapsed. So Israelis just got out of the habit of taking the bus to work, which used to be a norm. And nowadays, many of the buses run half empty or empty, if they run at all. No train service, railway service over the weekend, short hours of trains during the day, during the weekday, workday. And that means that once the country has become wide open, as it has for the past 3 or 4 weeks, there is more traffic congestion than ever before. It's just terrible, because people now drive their own cars. They don't want to use public transportation, partly because it's unreliable, partly because they got out of the habit, and partly because they don't want to be in a crowded space inside, despite the fact that we are moving away from the pandemic. That means everybody drives their own cars and such. So there is lots of traffic congestion, worse than any other country in the Western democracies. By the way, in the last 7 days, we have had 11 people dead in traffic accidents. That's an annual rate of almost 600, far more than we're losing to terrorists and various other problems. We have also lost 3 or 4. We only lost 3 or 4 people dead to the pandemic the last week, but we lost 11 just driving to work. So that's a very bad thing about Israeli life. About the pandemic. When the pandemic reached here late February, early March last year, the original response was very good. Very good, meaning the government took it very seriously. The country went into a lockdown quickly, which was obeyed by the vast majority of the people, vast majority of the time. So they came out of it after a month and a half, late April, saying, hey, we are okay. We have overcome. Then they opened up the entire system much too quickly. Too much optimism. It's an Israeli disease. Too much political pressure. Another Israeli disease. Perhaps too many fears about what will happen to the economy. There was inconsistently lockdowns, opening up, and vice versa. And there was a very poor example by our leaders. The worst case was Passover last year, the Seder, when we were told to stay home. And in particular, we were told not to get to a situation where we celebrate with anyone other than the nuclear family. So we spoke to our grandchildren via Zoom, which is nothing. But the president of the state, the prime minister, both hosted their families. Both of them gave various excuses of why it was different and they were unique. But that left a very bad taste in the mouth of the people who remember it even now. So there was inconsistency and a poor example by the leaders. And this was very bad and reached a terrible stage just a few months ago. The last wave, wave number 4 in Israel, was really getting bad in November and reached terrible heights by February. 3-4 months, again, total lockdown, no schools, no this, no that. You know this, unfortunately. But then we got lucky. It turned out that the one thing perhaps that the government did really right was to foresee the need for vaccines, to acquire large numbers of vaccines, and to get organized for distributing them very quickly. At the moment, as I speak to you, we have now vaccinated 5.4 million people in our country. That's 58% of the total population. 5.1 of them twice. So there's a gap of 300,000 people, but it's a matter of 3 days because in Israel, practically all the injections are Pfizer and all of them are given within 3 weeks of each other, of the two. So in 3 weeks, we will be at the 5.4 landmark, which is 58% of the total population. And this is very, very, very unique around the world. Nobody really among large countries comes close. And the success here, you have to say, is due both to the foresight of the leader, in this case, Netanyahu, whether or not you like him or hate his guts, 50-50, but he really hit a home run with this one. He acquired a huge number of vaccines, got them going quickly, and I already mentioned the efficiency of our healthcare system, which was brilliant in its performance in this way. They set up many, many places where you could get a quick injection close to home. You could register and get an appointment for whenever you wanted, wherever you wanted, close to home. And so we were able to inoculate a large part of the population. Now take a look at the numbers. We have, as I said, a population of 9.3 million total. About 2 million of them are children. So that leaves 7.3 million. And so we have 5.4 vaccinated and 850,000 recovered from COVID already. So that gives you a figure of about 6.25 or 6.3 million out of 9.3 million. That's about 2/3. So about 67% of the total population is protected now. And that comes pretty close to what Dr. Fauci likes to call herd immunity. Now he says there is no such thing. Of course, experts argue about this. World Health Organization supported research shows that herd immunity really means about 70% of the population. The Americans now speak about anywhere between 70% and 85% of the population. They may be overstating the case, or there may be something else. It may well be that the numbers in Israel are higher. It might well be that in addition to the 850,000 who are officially recovered from COVID-19, we have another 200, 300, 400,000 people who didn't report that they were sick and they recovered. So we might be not at 67%, but at 70%, which makes us eligible, so to speak, for the title of having accomplished a herd immunity. In any case, the numbers have gone down drastically. Numbers are very small. We're talking about 0.2% of the people who are tested now having the disease, many of them in an easy form. 2 or 3 months ago, we spoke about 1,200 people who were severely ill. The number is now way under 100. So all the signs are okay. And this despite the fact that we opened up the entire society for Passover celebrations and such, kids going back to school and so on and so forth. Still, it leaves about 1 million people who are eligible to be vaccinated who have not been. So that might leave us a bit short of herd immunity. And I blame the government that it's not continuing aggressively enough to try to either tempt, cajole, or threaten these 1 million to get in line and get injected and get the shot that they need so we can reach herd immunity. Of course, the expectation in Israel is that by the end of this month at the latest, perhaps as early as next week, the FDA in the US will approve the Pfizer and Moderna shots for kids between 12 and 16, which will be a whole new ballgame because that's now the most vulnerable part of the population. It's also a practical problem because, for example, I go to the swimming pool every morning because I have the green badge. I've been vaccinated twice. I cannot take my grandchildren with me because they are too young to be injected, vaccinated. They have not recovered, thank God, from any illness, so cannot enter the swimming pool, which is absurd. So perhaps when the kids will be vaccinated, which I think is a matter of a month or two, things will change even more for the better. By the way, a good piece of news is just literally 10 minutes before I turned on my computer this evening, the Israeli government has announced that it extends the validity of the so-called green badge or green pass from July to December. So the latest research we have in Israel is that the immunity acquired by the shot is good at least until the end of 2021. So that's the matter of the pandemic. Now, some foreign policy. I've put here a little list of what I call Biden's blunders. 5 points I would like to make. New administration in Washington, which in my humble opinion has committed 5 mistakes which are relevant to us. I hasten to add that in general, I think that President Biden's performance as president has been quite good. I think he sees correctly the need to rebuild American society, to overcome many cleavages, to bring a bit of peace and quiet after the endless controversies of the previous administration. In particular, does he see correctly that the US will not be able to compete with China for leading the world unless and until it regains the dynamic energy it used to have in terms of innovation, in terms of research, in terms of higher education. And it seems to be losing this race to China. And Biden is trying to reverse that with apparently good results. Above all, he has done great things in countering the pandemic. And the numbers in the US are also very, very good. 1/3 of the entire population already inoculated at least once. That's very impressive. As far as foreign policy is concerned, I'm not quite so happy. I think that he makes a mistake trying to erase everything that Trump did. Not everything that Trump did has to be bad. He tries to appease Iran too much, rushing to an old agreement, which was not good too quickly. I think that he has been too hasty in rejoining corrupt and discriminatory international agencies, such as the UN Human Rights Council. And I understand that he is in favor of multilateralism and international cooperation and institutions, and so am I. But these are bad institutions, which are corrupt, which are inefficient, sometimes wickedly political. And I think he should not have rejoined without forcing them to change, to improve, to make progress. 4, I think that he rushed back to renewing aid to the Palestinians without conditions of getting them to abandon extreme anti-Israeli moves and getting them to join a reasonable peace process. And finally, he has failed to build on the Abraham Accords, which were really revolutionary in terms of the paradigms of politicians in the Middle East. The Abraham Accords are there, and they are doing well, say, between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, but they have run out of gas. They have ground to a halt. The key to them was Saudi Arabia, the most important Arab country in that part of the world, in the Gulf, which was hesitating all along whether or not to join, and now seeing that the United States is not about to stand up to Iran, and the US is not about to be a good friend of Saudi Arabia, and the US is not about to be ambitious in what it tries to accomplish in the Middle East, rather wishing to retreat from the region. The Saudis, I think, have given up on this, and they are trying to rebuild fences with the Iranians instead. I think that's very bad. Now, to the thing that perhaps you are most interested in, and that's the political chaos in Israel. Now, like I said, I'm not going to argue now about Netanyahu forming the government or Lapid forming the government, or is Bennett making the right moves or not. If you wish, during the QA period, we can discuss some of these juicy issues. And they're not particularly interesting. What to me is interesting is the following points, which gives us, I think, this kind of analysis, the kind of depth which a person really is seeking through wisdom should be able to find. We know that this is the fourth inconclusive election in 2 years. So what is the reason for it? And how can we get ahead and reach a new era? There are three overwhelmingly important issues as far as I'm concerned, and I would like to discuss them with you. First, the personality issue. And I don't mean the personality of Netanyahu, which is complex enough as it is, but I'm actually asking the question, are we nearing the end of an era in which personality was the main issue? We had such a period in Israeli politics in the 1960s, when Ben-Gurion had been prime minister already for 11, 12, 13 years, just like Netanyahu. And after the 1961 election, he could not form a government with all his greatness and historical achievements. And he had to allow his deputy, Eshkol, to form the government, making him prime minister pro forma. And after 2 years, he just had to resign. And people ask, what will happen to Israel after Ben-Gurion? Can you imagine Israel without Ben-Gurion? Well, yes. The same question here. Can you imagine Israel without Netanyahu? Yes. Netanyahu has been a very dominant leader, a brilliant man with huge achievements, from diplomacy to security to economics to the pandemic. Also a difficult person who has made enemies of everybody around him, who is arrogant, who is inconsiderate, who is at times abrupt and rude in the way he handles people, including the President of the United States in the past. And it is a question whether we can put this era, which is dominated by a single person, behind us. The question in particular is addressed to his own party. Is Likud really Netanyahu? Is Netanyahu Likud? Isn't there a Likud without Netanyahu? This is a question they will have to ask, and very soon, because that means, the question means whether or not they will form the government or not. As it happens, the personality issue drives everybody crazy. Nobody is neutral towards Netanyahu. You hate his guts or you admire him. There's nothing in between. And the split is close. 40% admire him, 45% hate his guts, the others are in between. It also cuts across every other political cleavage. Mind you, ladies and gentlemen, the right wing in Israel has won a huge victory in the election. There are 58 members of the would-be Netanyahu coalition, all right-wing or religious and ultra-Orthodox. But there are also 7 seats of Lieberman and 6 seats of Gideon Sa'ar. Right-wing people, 13 seats. If you add these 13 seats to the 58, you have a 71 member majority out of 120. But it won't happen because the 13 won't join the 58. Why? Because of Netanyahu. So it's not a matter of left or right. It's just a matter of Bibi or not Bibi. We must put this behind us and get back to some kind of reasonable political discourse. Left-right makes sense. Bibi or not Bibi doesn't make sense. Second point, the ultra-Orthodox. This is the most rapidly growing part of the population in Israel, already 11%. And these people had a terrible time during the pandemic. They were hurt badly, often abandoned by their own leaders for political purposes. And yet they had to change. If they wanted schooling, they had to use a telephone, if not a computer, never seen before. Some of them have started using smartphones, which is a real revolution in the lives of everyone, as you can see with your own kids. Something is happening there. And the ultra-Orthodox also have to ask, what's in all this for us? Are we really right-wing? Some are not. What's it to us? One of the great Orthodox rabbis of the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox says, we don't care how large Israel is, we care about how Jewish it is. That's not a right-wing rhetoric. Will the ultra-Orthodox, for example, enter a coalition which is not a right-wing coalition? Will they be mobile from one part of the political spectrum to another? Will they be flexible? Will they try to get the government to do something for them beyond handing out the allocations to their institutions to change the lives of the people so they will be better prepared for a productive life? For example, a core curriculum which teaches them mathematics, science, English, computers. This is on the table. And most on the table is a possible new era in Jewish-Arab relations. For the first time, we have a party in the Knesset, an Arab party, which proves what I found in my surveys of Arab citizens of Israel 10 years ago. Namely, that they don't care that much about the Palestinians. They don't care so much about the ideological arguments of Jewish state or not Jewish state. They care about their own lives, about their livelihoods, about their family, about their quality of life, about their education, about a dignified place for themselves and their families in the future in Israel, be it Jewish state or not by some definition. So now we have an Islamic party of all people, of all parties, saying more or less this. Yes, we are Palestinians, we are Muslims, we identify with them, blah, blah, but we are citizens of Israel, and we would like to improve our lives in Israel, and the way to do it is to join a coalition where we will have plenty of weight, plenty of influence, plenty of clout, which we will use to better the lives of Arab citizens in Israel. If that kind of ideology, and it's not an incident, it's a right-wing Arab party. They are not nice guy socialists who believe in peace and brotherhood. They are Islamists who say, because we are Islamists, it's easier for us to identify with the Jews. The Jews are nationalists, we are nationalists. The Jews are conservative, we are conservative. Jews are religious, we are religious. True, we follow a different religion, but we are religious. So if that four-member party indeed enters the coalition one way or another, either by direct participation or else by refraining from bringing it down in votes of confidence, it's a new Israel. It opens up endless possibilities for a different relationship between Jews and Arabs. The final point, because I'm running out of time, is the relative strength in the election of traditional parties, which seemed weak. Likud, Labor, Meretz, National Religious Party are historical phenomena in Israeli politics, and they all have their adherents, and these adherents keep voting for them no matter what happens, and that gives a sense of stability to Israeli politics.
Sorry, Professor, you accidentally muted yourself. If you would unmute, please.
Can you hear me now?
Very good, thank you.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Don't ever get mixed up between politics and society in Israel. We have a vibrant, healthy society with a poor government. And despite that, there's a relatively good governance, not government, but governance, for example, the health system. And there are serious social cleavages. Nobody argues that they are not in existence between Jews and Arabs, religious and secular, and so on. But these can and should be contained in the political system. Somebody wins a majority, somebody compromises. But the personal issue, the personality issue around Bibi Netanyahu confuses and overshadows everything else and doesn't even make a right-left cleavage coherent. This is not the fault of the system. This is the fault of the culture of the present discourse, which centers around the personality of a single person. Okay, let me end this presentation by two jokes. which come back to my original theme, the pursuit of wisdom, which is, I think, the thing that really ties me, the Posen family, and to the memory of their parents, Harry and Blanche. So there is the first one, which is very, very well known. Once there was a religious man who was out to sea fishing, when all of a sudden a wave came and flipped his boat and destroyed it. His boat having been smashed to pieces, our friend finds a wooden board to cling to. He's not worried, rather he remains calm, faithful in his God, who will surely save him. A few hours after he'd been thrown into the water, a cruise ship comes by, sees him stranded and offers to rescue him. The man responds, "No worries, God will save me," and shoos them away. A few hours later, a helicopter flies by, spots the man, hovers and calls out to him. Again, he shoos them away, confident that God will save him. Lastly, a fishing boat happens by the man, tries to save him, and like the others, is refused, told that, "My God will save me." Needless to say, after a good long while in the water, clinging to the board, our friend slips away and is lost to the sea. Upon entering heaven, our friend has a bone to pick. He turns to God and demands to know why he was not saved. Had he not been a good religious man? Had he not had faith in his Savior? But God retorts, "I did try to save you. I sent you a boat. I sent you a helicopter and even another boat." So he didn't grasp divine wisdom. In his own faith, he was smart, but he was not wise. He could not grasp the depth of the infinite wisdom of God. Same in this very fine one-liner, two-liner about a poor man walking in the forest who feels close enough to God to ask, "God, what is a million years to you?" And God replies, "My son, a million years to you is like a second to me." So the man asks God, "What is $1 million to you?" And God replies, "My son, $1 million to you is less than a penny to me. It means almost nothing to me." So then the man asks, "So God, can I have $1 million?" And God replies, "In a second." So don't try to match wits with God, because his wisdom is infinite and ours is very limited. It is incumbent upon us to increase our own wisdom without ever pretending to be nearly as wise as the divine being. Thank you very much. I hope I haven't overstepped my time, and I'm now ready to take your questions.
Professor, thank you so much for your time. I'm going to ask, very good. We'll just stop sharing your screen. We can see each other. Just another thank you to you for your research and for the good learning that we're doing together. I have a handful of a short handful of questions, and I'll encourage others to continue writing in questions into the chat box. We're going to take about 10 or 15 minutes or so, and hopefully we can reach all of the questions, and I do apologize if we do not have time to get to yours. The first question that was posed is asking if you might speak about, elaborate on the country's security and political challenges.
Political and security challenges?
Yeah, and in 15 minutes nonetheless.
15 minutes or 15 hours? Look, let's try the security challenges first. The greatest security challenge is the existential threat contained in the Iranian nuclear project. In fact, that's the only existential threat we are facing. And everything else is a menace. Everything else is a disturbance, annoying, but not really life-threatening. This one is life-threatening. So this is challenge number one. And so all the best minds in the country are busy trying to find the best way to counter it. We have a constant dialogue with the White House on this. We have a dialogue with others about this. And we're also doing all kinds of things about this. You might read a little bit about this in your newspapers. And it's just the surface of the iceberg, so to speak. This is the greatest challenge. Second challenge is not the Iranian nuclear bomb, but Iranian radical terrorism all around the Middle East, threatening us from our borders, for example, the Hezbollah in Lebanon. The third security challenge is the Gaza Strip, which is a problem for the south of the country and in general is becoming a menace for the rest of the country because the increase of their rocket capability. Fourth security challenge is terrorism inside the country, which despite the recent incident in Tapuach is not as serious as it used to be, doesn't claim, thank God, as many casualties. These are the main ones. But I think they are very serious ones because the Iranian challenge in itself is overwhelmingly difficult. Iran is a large country. It's a subcontinent, close to 100 million people, a fairly sophisticated middle class with good technological capabilities. And even when we are able to destroy some of their facilities, the knowledge remains, research remains, accumulated experience remains. So that's a very, very tough one. And I think that if you wake up the Israeli Prime Minister, Minister of Defense, Intelligence Chief, and so on, and ask them, why didn't you sleep well tonight? This is likely to be, I think, the most frequent answer they will give you. As for political challenges, they are endless. We have to build a government, which we don't have. We have to pass a budget, which we don't have. We have to reach some kind of consensus on major issues bothering us at the moment. For instance, the proper balance between the judiciary and the legislative and executive branches of government, an endless question in democracies. They have to deal with the question of what to do with the Palestinians. Within this, some of the right-wing parties would like to annex more territory. Some of the left-wing parties would like to renew the dialogue with some kind of Palestinian leadership. There are huge problems with the secular religious divide in Israel. As I said, the ultra-Orthodox are growing in numbers, and that means that they are going to have more influence in the Knesset in the future. And this is a community which must join the mainstream of Israeli life, which it really hasn't done fully yet. Many of the men don't work because they study all the time. Many of the educational systems of the ultra-Orthodox do not have a core curriculum which prepares people for modern life and occupation. They don't learn mathematics enough. They don't learn enough about science. They don't learn English. And they don't know enough about science and computer technology, which is indispensable. So that's a huge issue. And these are the main political issues in Israel today. That's plenty. I must add also that if you see this as very confusing and chaotic, this has been seen before. We have seen such crises before. And I think that the societal and economic resources and also diplomatic resources we now have are far more numerous and far more potent than anything we had in the past. So true that the challenges are huge, but our abilities are also huge. So I think that at the moment, there is a sense of balance lacking between the two. The enormous potential is not converted into kinetic energy because the lack of a stable government. But it's just a matter of time for us to overcome this mess.
Thank you. And you have another question from Frida Muskovich, who's also noted that was born in Haifa as well, and asked, in light of this, if you might elaborate a little bit on Israelis' optimism.
Yes, Israel's optimism is somehow part of the DNA in Israel. Israel was established in 1948 against all odds. Israel won that war 48-49 against all odds. It has managed against all odds to win all the wars since. It has managed against all odds to absorb a huge number of immigrants. And with all that, to build up a vibrant economy, which is doing very well, as you have seen from the numbers and data I've quoted. So the Israeli ability to improvise, to come up with innovation, to respond to challenges is part of our DNA. We know we have difficulties. We live in a very tough neighborhood. We are a very small country. We face very, very great challenges, but we have overcome everything so far. So we believe we'll overcome in the future also. And like I said, there is also the sense of solidarity. People know what they live for. There is a country that most people are proud of. There is a society in which people have a sense of community, at least in their part of society, that they will be helped, assisted, supported, protected when in need. And I think that's the main reason for the kind of optimism we Israelis have.
Thank you. Let's move back to another geopolitical question coming in about. Might you speak about the current relationship with Israel and Turkey and Russia, particularly regarding the relationship with the new pipeline?
Okay. First, I want to make the point that unlike in previous periods in its history, Israel is on good terms with every major power in the world. Despite the tension with the Biden White House on the Iranian issue, relations between Israel and the US are very good. Economic aid is flowing. There is technological, intelligence, and security cooperation on all levels. And the relationship is basically very sound. We are on good terms with China, which creates an interesting triangle, China, US, Israel. US is pushing us to reduce the level of Chinese involvement in our country. In my own hometown of Haifa, almost everything is made by the Chinese. A tunnel system, which makes transportation much easier, was built by the Chinese. A railway system from the sea to Mount Carmel has just been completed by a Chinese company. All the roads in the city have been built by the Chinese. Worst of all, from the American point of view, the Chinese are building the new port of Haifa. And that's a port in which the US Sixth Fleet is supposed to stay every so often. There is a security problem. The Chinese have bought up Israel's largest food producing company. They are buying up everything they can, and they are trying to utilize our technology and our know-how. The Americans are unhappy about it, but like I said, we are on good terms with China. We are on excellent terms with India, which despite the terrible suffering of the pandemic at this time, are the next coming superpower. By the way, overtaking China in population within the next decade. Also, how funny and how depressing life can be. India, which is suffering the worst from the pandemic, is also the largest producer and exporter of vaccines in the world. So there you have it. As for Russia, we are on good terms with Russia. Russia has its own agenda, and Russia is very aggressive about its agenda, unlike China, by the way. The Russians use a lot of force. They are very vocal. They are very abrupt and very rude, and they are in a hurry. They are like a young man in a hurry. Why? Because they're on the decline. Their population is shrinking, going down. Their economy is nothing to write home about. Their GDP is equivalent to that of Italy, which is a second-rate Western country in Europe. So they're on the decline, so they would like to use the potential they now have to the utmost. The Chinese are patient. The Chinese are not using power, they are building power. They are building infrastructure, they are building roads, they are building ports, they are building airports, they are building tunnels, they are building junctions, they are building railways. These will stay in the Middle East long after the Russian tanks go home. So you have to be on good terms with all these people. So Israel plays a juggling act, particularly with Russia, because Russia has its own interest in Syria, which is a problem for us because we have to operate over the skies of Syria to hit the Iranian effort at getting installed close to the Israeli border and to threaten us from not from afar anymore. This we couldn't do without the permission and possible tacit cooperation of the Russians. So this exists. We also cooperate against terrorism. I've been privy to meetings with some Russians on this, on anti-terrorism. There's also technological exchange. And there is a Russia, speaking of personalities, Russia is dominated by a leader, Putin, who surprisingly has a soft spot for Jews. It may have to do with his Jewish teacher in high school, some people, and so on and so forth. He speaks well of Jews. He supports Jewish causes in Russia. I personally was present at the speech he gave in Israel some years ago when he visited my hometown, my former hometown of Netanya, where he gave a speech on the occasion of celebrating the liberation of Jewish death camps by Russian soldiers in World War II, in which he said, we may have our differences, we don't always see eye to eye, but I can tell you we will never do anything which will jeopardize Israel's security, let alone existence. That's from the president of Russia. That's pretty good. And the Russians are probably as good as their word. They are not doing anything directly anti-Israeli. They are not supporting terrorism against Israel anymore. They are not arming Israel's worst enemies. There is the Syrian issue where we have a sense of cooperation, and there is the Iranian issue. But again, my Russian friends, such as they are, assure me that what they are doing there is not intended to injure Israel in any way. They are doing it simply to spite the Americans. They don't want American domination. They don't want an American world order in which the Americans will tell this country or that country what they can do, whether or not they can build a nuclear capability. And for the Russians and the Chinese, it's a very convenient platform on which aggressively they can attack the United States, diplomatically speaking, to challenge its geopolitical domination of the region. That's it. So I would say that we are in surprisingly good shape as far as foreign policy is concerned.
Thank you, Professor. And perhaps we'll take just one more question from Professor David DeWitt, who writes, you mentioned the Biden administration has not proceeded enhancing the Abraham Accords. How might Israel build upon what now exists and perhaps even expand the countries involved in support of regional security?
Yeah, thank you. That's a kind of embarrassing question because Professor DeWitt probably knows the answer better than I can put it here, but let me try anyway. By the way, he and I might write a book on this one day, perhaps in the foreseeable future. Yeah, just to utilize the platform for a bit of advertising for myself and my friend. What Israel can do is to make sure that the Abraham Accords pay, to strengthen cooperation, particularly with the United Arab Emirates. The UAE was the originator on the Arab side. It is a very rich country with plenty of potential, and there is very tight cooperation, and Israel should tighten that cooperation even more. Israel should help the weaker members of the Abraham Accords, namely Morocco and Sudan, need more help, more assistance, more know-how. Israel should be considerate of them and not to provoke them. Unilateral Israeli moves, for example, in my opinion, of annexation, would undermine the accords badly. So I'm not in favor of them for that reason, for other reasons also. So I think you have to be considerate of your friends if you want to cultivate friendship. And in particular, you have to show these people that friendship pays, that what they expect us to deliver will be delivered. We will cooperate with them. They will gain from our know-how. They will gain access to our market, and we will continue our security cooperation so as to enhance their ability to stand up to Iranian aggression. Unfortunately, for the latter, we need a lot more American involvement and support than we are getting from the present administration. But since I am an eternal Israeli optimist, I think that the people there will learn from this sooner or later, and they might revise their approach as time goes on, as they put their house in order in the US, as they get disappointed from the radical, aggressive tendencies of Iran. I think that many of the people around Biden will come around and things will improve compared to the present situation. There is total disagreement between the White House and the Israeli government on the question of how to proceed versus Iran. Let me just qualify that statement. Perhaps this will be the last few words I will say tonight, that within Israel itself, there is some disagreement, which is to say, not between political parties. Most political parties agree with Netanyahu and his government that these American moves are hasty, they are premature, and altogether bad. But I must say that among my former students in the defense, security, intelligence establishment, many disagree. And they feel that while the present agreement, the 2015 agreement was bad, and Iran is bad boys all the way, it is better to have some measure of control over Iranian nuclear development by international oversight, no matter how incomplete, than not having any influence over what happens there. And many people even feel that our good relations with China and Russia might be harnessed to restrain the ambitions of Iran on the nuclear area. And so I don't know. I mean, most Israelis have come to terms with the fact that the US is not interested in dominating the Middle East or playing a major role in the Middle East. They want to go away and take care of their own problems, the problems with China in East Asia. And therefore, they just want to close the book on this Iranian matter. Therefore, they are in a rush to conclude an agreement, and Israel cannot stop that. We just have to take that as a fact of life, live with it, and do the best under the circumstances.
Thank you, Professor, and we look forward to reading your eventual writing with David about this topic as well. I want to turn it over now to Stephen. I think that we can all say thank you, but we'll turn it over to Stephen to offer a proper thank you.
I don't know that my thank you will be any more proper, pardon me, than anybody else's. But Gabby, you are above all else, to my mind, you're a teacher and you're a long-term friend, both of which we value immensely. You've kind of done it again. You've taken a complex situation and you've made the incomprehensible somewhat comprehensible. You live in a very dangerous neighborhood, and all your optimism at the beginning is unnerving to me because as you know, you and I fence over this often. I always look to you for the optimistic result. But the other thing is that I am concerned that my young son, my 22-year-old son, might come to live in Israel at some point. I'll be okay with that for a period of time, but I'm concerned that you may entice him for a longer period. You balance many competing interests and cultures, and you seem to mostly make sense of it all. You said that we are your teachers. Hardly think that. But in Israel's optimism, the economics, the happiness report, and so on, it's all very good news. I want to say that our mother, Blanche Posen, always said she could get anywhere in 10 minutes. It just mattered how fast she drove. I've given the same lecture where I've been allocated 12 minutes or 1 hour. It's just a matter of how fast you talk. Gabby, I don't know how you get it all into one place. I'm glad the questions were asked about the political and security situations because I did want to hear a little bit about that. But Gabby, you honor our parents and their memory, and you honor our entire family by speaking with us every year. Your wisdom, your knowledge, and your unbelievable articulate manner in your third or fourth language educate us, you inform us, and you center us. You haven't made me feel so optimistic this time. You've made me centered, and you have taken away my pessimism about the way things look over there, both politically and security-wise. I thank you for that. Thank you for coming electronically to North America again, and hopefully in person next year. I don't know how to say it in Hebrew. Lashana Haba Yerushalayim, Toronto. Thank you very, very much for all of that. Thank you for doing that. And I want to not thank you in advance, but I look forward to this being done for many years again in the future. Be safe, be well, lehitraot. As my Uncle Aaron used to say, Gegazin Kumgazin. I can't tell you Gegazin right now. Come soon, come well. We look forward to it. Thank you so, so, so very much for what you've done for our family and for our parents' memory. Thank you.
Thank you.
So absolutely,
You're muted.
a round of applause is certainly merited. And thank you to the Posen family as well for making this incredible lecture possible each year. Just a quick, brief word with some upcoming programs, some upcoming Israel programs at Holy Blossom. We hope we have two really wonderful, a whole summer of wonderful programs planned, but I just want to just mention two really interesting pieces. So on Monday, June 14th at noon, we will be joined by DJ Schneeweiss, a familiar name, the former Consul General of Toronto, who now works at the National Library of Israel. And we will be joined by DJ Schneeweiss, and he'll be sharing some of the gems of the collection at the National Library in Israel. And then we'll also hope you will save the date in your calendars for noon on Monday, June 28th, and the evening of Tuesday, June 29th. We will be joined by the iconic Israeli writer Etgar Keret. And so we hope that you will join us there as well. That is open to members of Holy Blossom as well as the many friends of Holy Blossom that are with us this afternoon. Again, another thank you to you, Professor Ben-Dor. and thank you to everyone as well. I believe that we will be sharing your PowerPoint presentation in a thank you email. So you can be on the lookout for an email from Naomi, which will include both a recording of our lecture as well as his PowerPoint. So thank you again, and a special thank you to Les Rothschild, the co-chair of the Holy Blossom Israel Engagement Committee, who is instrumental in putting and in organizing all of this together. We look forward to joining with you next year in Toronto. Okay, everyone, take care. Thank you for being here.